Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and welcome to the Washington office of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. I am Russell Wald, Senior Manager for External Affairs here at Hoover, where I lead our government relations on national security. And welcome to Policy Prescriptions for the North Korean threat. I will be standing in for Helene Cooper, who is covering today's tragic shooting in Alexandria. And let me say, on behalf of the Hoover Institution, our thoughts are with the victims, their families, and the security teams that are working to keep us safe. So on that somber note, I'll turn as to why we're here in the first place. Under the Kim dynasty, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea continues to violate international norms as it speeds to further develop their nuclear weapons arsenal and delivery systems. Former CIA Director Michael Hayden has expressed grave concern over this, that North Korea will be able to hit the United States' western coast as quickly as 2020, which only adds to the urgency of this issue. 1 year ago, the Hoover Institution and the U.S. Korea Institute at the School of Advanced International Studies, commonly known as SAIS, hosted a conference to discuss the rising North Korea threat. The conference established a series of policy recommendations on how the incoming administration can best address the dangers of a nuclear-armed North Korea. Today, we welcome a panel of high-profile speakers to discuss and analyze current and future policy prescriptions to the Korean Peninsula. Before I introduce our distinguished guest, I want to offer special thanks to the U.S. Korea Institute at SAIS for their partnership on this project. And I also want to thank Ambassador James Goodby, Dr. John Merrill, Dr. Jay Koo, Deborah Gordon, and Paige Mathis for helping make this event possible. It is now my honor to introduce our expert panelist on this occasion today. Dr. Michael Oslin is a resident scholar and director of Japan Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. His latest work, titled The End of the Asian Century, War, Stagnation, and the Risk to the World's Most Dynamic Region, is a comprehensive account of the economic, military, political, and demographic risk facing the Asian continent. Dr. Oslin is also a former associate professor at Yale University and a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and National Review. We're also excited to announce formally today that Dr. Oslin is joining Hoover as a Williams Griffiths Fellow in Contemporary Asia. So, welcome.
Thank you. As
of July 1st. To my right is Dr. Bill Perry. He's a senior fellow here at the Hoover Institution, and then Michael and Barbara Barbarian Professor Emeritus at Stanford University. He's best known, however, for his exemplary service as the Secretary of Defense from 1994 to 1997. And since 2013, Dr. Perry spent well beyond 2013, Dr. Perry spent his time educating the public on the current dangers of nuclear weapons, and through this, his nonprofit, the William J. Perry Project, which I encourage people to go check out, particularly students who are watching or in the audience. If you go to wjperryproject.org, he has a variety of videos and classes that you can learn from, MOOCs and other short video clips. And down at the end of the table, we're honored to have Senator Richard Lugar here, who has served as a U.S. Senator from Indiana from 1977 until his retirement in 2013. While in Congress, he twice served as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and as ranking member from 2007 to 2013. Senator Lugar is the longest-serving senator from the state of Indiana and retired as the most senior Republican member of the Senate. So welcome to all three of you. Before I begin, I want to set the table for our discussion that our report noted and just have a clear idea of what we noted within that report. And I want to talk about the four principles that this group had looked at, and what the Kim regime has four goals that we see. Number one, Maintaining the Kim regime is the primary objective. Number 2, attaining international recognition, respect, and dignity. Number 3, developing an economy. And number 4, achieving unification under its own terms. In contrast, within the report, we note that U.S. goals are less clear. The questions of denuclearization or halting or freezing programs still remains an unclear pathway forward. And so with that, I'm going to use that as just to set the table, and then I'm going to start with a question. And I want to start with a question with Dr. Perry. You've stated that strategic patience, the policy of the Obama administration, that the Kim regime would fail on its own and will internally fall. You've stated that that process has failed. Therefore, something has to be done, yet you've uniquely stated that in this current crisis we're in, the window of opportunity for diplomacy is now. So can you describe what a good U.S. diplomatic process will look like in this case?
First, let me say that my criticism of U.S. foreign policy has been bipartisan. I was critical both of the Obama administration and the Bush administration in that those are the two administrations in which we went from no nuclear weapons to many nuclear weapons. And by definition, that's a failure. You can debate whether or not the process they used was wise or non-wise, but the results were pretty clear. So I'm critical of what we have done in the past for both administrations. The first thing I would say about any policy approach to North Korea, it should start off by not underestimating them. And those in the administration today who call them as being crazy or irrational are dramatically underestimating this regime. And any military man can tell you the worst thing you can do is underestimate your adversaries. You have to judge them carefully. They're ruthless, they're reckless, but they're not irrational. The demonstration of that is since the Soviet Union collapsed, Stalinist regimes all over the world, one by one, fell, except North Korea. It's the last Stalinist state left standing. And that doesn't happen by accident. It happens by shrewd diplomacy, by shrewd actions, and they have done that. So if we're going to deal with them, we better understand who it is we're dealing with. We also have to understand what their primary objective is, which is sustaining the Kim dynasty, keeping the regime in power. They have other objectives too, but they're all subordinate to that primary objective. And any diplomacy we take, any approach we take to them, has to start off understanding that that's what their side of the table is saying. Any diplomat to really succeed has to not only have a golden tongue, but he has to have good ears. He has to listen to what the other side is saying and try to understand what their objectives are. They have perhaps 15 to 20 nuclear weapons today. They have hundreds of smaller range missiles, and they're developing an ICBM. It's a very dangerous situation. But one danger we do not face, in my judgment, is the danger that they're going to launch a surprise attack on Seoul or Tokyo or Los Angeles when they get a long enough missile to do that. Because, as I said, they're not irrational. This is not Al-Qaeda we're dealing with. This is not ISIS we're dealing with. They're not seeking suicide. They're not seeking martyrdom. They're seeking to keep the regime in power. And they know if they conduct an unprovoked attack on any of us, that their leaders will be killed and their country devastated. So that's not what they're doing. Nevertheless, those nuclear weapons are very dangerous, and we need to find a diplomatic approach to dealing with that. The diplomatic approach has to be coercive diplomacy. We have to have strong sticks as well as strong incentives, which we have not had in the past. And in my judgment, that requires a partnership with China. In other words, we can't simply turn to China and say, you solve the problem. They have the sticks, but we have the incentives. So it has to be a partnership. Obviously, the partnership has to involve South Korea and Japan, too, as it always has. But it's difficult and challenging to form that kind of a diplomatic team, but that's what is required of us in order to solve it. I think that's enough to say right now, but to launch this diplomacy, we need a diplomatic solution. It has to be coercive diplomacy, and it has to involve, besides the United States, South Korea, and Japan, it has to involve China as an active partner, and that's the fundamental groundwork we need in going into diplomacy.
Okay. Michael, I want to give you an opportunity to speak here because you weren't part of the drafting of the report, so I'd like to get your views for the record. And I want to start with the first question for you. If diplomacy, is it denuclearization or freeze?
So first, let me start off by saying it's a pleasure to be here at Hoover. I think this is actually my first event ever at Hoover, but it's a nice rollout. I very much look forward to joining here and doing a lot more events on these issues. And coming in as someone who wasn't part of the original report and who also has worked widely on regional issues as opposed to specifically and narrowly on North Korea, I think does potentially give some different views on the issues. The question of diplomacy that you just asked, I want to get to that in a second if I can, but continue a little bit of what Dr. Perry just mentioned, and I think that the broad-based agreement that we have now in 2017, we're not talking about 1994, we're not talking about 2005. It has not been a static situation, obviously, that we're dealing with. So the thought processes that we have to go through, the assessments we have to make, I think, are completely different. Whether it's a reboot or whatever you want to call it, falling back on the idea that we've had this periods of engagement and disengagement. Now we're just going to go back into engagement is probably the wrong way to think about it. I think that what Secretary Perry has alluded to is sort of the ground base from which you start, which is a recognition of the essential rationality of the regime, its survival, and quite honestly, I think we have to admit this, its success. Kim Jong-un down the line, sounds crazy to say this, may well be seen as an incredibly successful leader. The economy's been stabilized. He is moving very far along on achieving goals that are both nuclear and missile capabilities. He is, in some ways, securing the future of this regime far more so than we would have thought 10 years ago or so. We may need to change our mental picture of thinking about this regime, as was mentioned before, that you don't, if you call them crazy, you're starting off at your own disadvantage. It may behoove us to think of this as actually a very successful regime and, believe it or not, a very successful leader. And then how do we go into that set of negotiations? I think what's most interesting to me about what Secretary Perry said is that you essentially have, if you step back from the immediacy of a question about a 6th nuclear test and an ultimately successful ICBM test, you have almost a condition of stability right now. I mean, in one way, we've been in this stable environment for several decades, punctuated, of course, by moments of what we interpret as crisis, but not a crisis that has actually changed the strategic foundations on which this environment and this relationship have been evolving. There has been stability, which raises certain questions. Number one, if the North Koreans do get an ICBM, which we almost reflexively say is an existential threat to the United States, yes, as a technology, as a tool, it is an existential threat to the United States. Politically, is it an existential threat to the United States? In some way, potentially not, if we go along the line of logic, which I agree with Secretary Perry, that this is a regime that wants to survive. Okay, not if you think that this is a regime that wants to survive. So what actually changes? What actually changes when North Korea demonstrates a reliable, weaponized nuclear program? From one perspective, everything, and from other perspectives, maybe nothing if we look beyond the security challenge of the moment and think about what do they want politically. That does not account for the risks that we would encounter with that level of capability on North Korea, risks of accidents, risks of miscalculation, or risks of a crisis that spins out of control, so that you have, unfortunately, a very different and differently capable North Korea circa 2017, 2018 than you did in 1994. None of us should minimize those risks. But has the long-term goal then, not only of North Korea, but of the United States, changed? And I think here's where I'll circle back to your question on what should the diplomatic goal of the United States be. Again, not as a North Korea person who's dealt with North Korea solely for decades, but it seems to me that the United States goal under Republican and Democratic administrations has been pretty consistent. It is ultimately to see the passing away of the Kim regime, the Kim family regime, as the first step. And then secondly, what we hope obviously would be a peaceful reunification of the peninsula under liberal auspices. And there's a long road in between those two things. But I don't think that that ultimate goal has changed. The way we have pursued it, I think, again, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, has been a combination of containment, deterrence, negotiations, offering of certain things that we think they might want in order to moderate behavior. But both sides have pursued that. Maybe the one real exception might have been, and we're a little too close to make a historical judgment on, is the Obama administration's strategic patience post-Leap Day Agreement of 2012. But after that, really no engagement, and whether or not that changed the environment at all. So if we move towards that, I think we should recognize that denuclearization is most likely, at least as long as the regime survives, a chimera that we really cannot follow. We cannot put any hope in either coming into negotiations expecting or wanting or demanding denuclearization, or actually then pursuing along that path. But rather, I would argue, it is continued containment and deterrence. Within that, and certainly I think the judgment of an enormous number of extremely wise and experienced people on this panel has been that freeze should be the first stage that is attempted. Freeze because you actually then stop progress in the short term, progress towards an ICBM capability or progress towards a functional nuclear, if not hydrogen capability. That's certainly something that I think diplomatically we should be thinking about. But as we're doing that, I think we have to take that broader context into account and think much more, at a much more fundamental level, in fact, about what the United States has tried to do, what the North Koreans want to do, and in some ways, I would say, it seems odd to say it, but in some ways almost embrace that stability as we figure out how we're going to deal with what is likely to be the one thing we had presidents of both parties tell us we would never have, which is a nuclear-capable North Korea.
Okay, well said. I want to turn this over to both the practitioners in on this panel who've engaged in diplomacy and say, if we did take a diplomatic path, what would that look like? How should we get there? And we had some pre-discussion time about this, of where we've consistently sat around and said, this diplomacy is a good idea. How do we get there? Do we have a special envoy? Do we engage in six-party talks again? Do we look into bilateral talks? What would be your advice? And I'll start with you, Senator Lugar. And also, too, if I could ask that when speaking at the mic, if we could pull them a little bit closer and speak more into the mic. Thank you.
I feel like a citizen amateur today with my two distinguished panelists. They have written extensively about North Korea, and I have read their articles and pieces with great profit, as many of you have. I really come at the problem from a standpoint that I recall, as most of you do, a period of 3 or 4 decades of what was called mutually assured destruction. These were times in which both the former Soviet Union and the United States had a sufficient number of weapons to be able to knock out all of the military facilities, but were still all of the major cities and other important locations in the United States of America. As a young mayor of Indianapolis, I was unaware of that time. I became aware one time when I was going down into a silo where a missile had been pulled out in Siberia, and there was a guard post at the bottom there. You took an elevator to get down to it, and there were pictures around the walls of American cities. And I thought, oh my goodness. When I got back, I asked just out of curiosity, was Indianapolis ever targeted? And they said it sure was. Everybody was, whether we were aware of it or not. At this particular time, it was not possible for the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union to move ahead. But we came to a point, as a matter of fact, in which President Reagan was very hopeful, and he sent 16 senators in a bipartisan group, a wise man, knowing a 2/3 majority would be required for a treaty in the Senate, to Geneva for negotiations with the Soviet Union. The senators were not going to negotiate. We were to be witnessing the negotiations. Unfortunately, 1991 was not the year for this, but it was a time in which we really all got religion. We understood how devastating the problem was. And it was from that particular time that my partner, Sam Nunn, who was then chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and I continued to meet with Russians during the next 5 years or so. I go into all this biographical sketch simply to say that there came a time in which the instability, much of it caused by economic failure, quite apart from political situation, in the Soviet Union led to some drastic problems. I remember very vividly in the summer of 1996, a group of people from Russia coming to the Senate office. They sat around a table in Sam's office, a round table. And I can remember distinctly one of the ladies, who was an emissary from the Soviet Union, looking at me straight in the eye and saying, "You folks in the United States have got a lot of problems." I said, "Well, what do you see as our problems?" She said, "Well," she says, "the nuclear weapons that are aimed at you, in some cases now are unguarded. The soldiers that have been guarding them have deserted. They're not getting paid. We're bankrupt, in essence, and it's not going to change." And so what may have been mutually assured destruction had at least some controls for 40 years. She was describing a situation in which there were perhaps no controls. There could be accidents and shots fired that no one knew who shot who. And so I said, "Well, what do you want from us?" And she said, "We're going to need a lot of your money, for one thing. We're going to need a lot of inspectors that will help take down the missiles and the warheads and so forth. We may even need some of your troops by the time we're finished." This is sort of an awesome experience. And it was from this day forward, the so-called non-cooperative threat reduction program started with great help from Ash Carter, who came down from the Belfer School with a white paper on what ought to be involved in such legislation. I go through all of that to say that we are facing a new problem, and with North Korea. Fortunately, it's not a situation in which both the United States and North Korea at this point have thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at each other and all of our installations and so forth. We still do have the 1,550 under the New START Treaty and various other weapons. But the North Koreans have a momentum toward an ICBM. I mean, intercontinental ballistic missile, one that could hit us here in the United States. And even if they only have maybe at this point 25 bombs, none of them would be suitable to shoot right now on an ICBM, they are on the trail of being able to produce much more weaponry. We're at a point in terms of national security, which I believe is very serious. It's not as serious as the Soviet Union threat, but it could be. We have some time to give some thought to it, but also to begin to take some action. Now, in my own view, we're going to need to think through how we can take action that really gets to the heart of what we've been talking about in terms of the security of the regime. That's the number one issue for the leader in North Korea. His regime, for the time being, seems to be very solid. He has eliminated even relatives from the family, quite apart from hundreds of people who might be of some threat to him, and seems really quite determined to hang on. But at the same time, when the North Korean government begins making threats to the United States, this is a different time situation for us. I see possibilities and I really defer to those of you who have much more background about North Korea and its economy than I do. But I believe that it's a regime in which the total population has not been particularly well served. Now, one can make a case that in recent times, people have been able to get more food. Some of this has come through the UN World Food Program or through all sorts of humanitarian efforts. Some has come because there has been an increase in the gross national product of North Korea. But there are limits, clearly, to that growth, and likewise ways in which that security might be reduced. We have heard of one of them in which the Chinese no longer will buy coal from North Korea. That cuts back the income substantially. Of course, much more severe would be a situation in which there was no further development with regard to oil coming backward or forward. Beyond that, there are, I suspect, other means of making North Korea much more economically insecure, a situation that becomes very problematical for the leadership. Now, this isn't the same sort of thing as diplomacy for the moment, but it gets to the heart of how we are going to change the ground rules here so that it's possible for diplomats, and they may be a team that includes the United States and South Korea and China, maybe others for that matter, begins to talk to the leader at a time in which the leader understands that his longevity and that of his state is at stake, and takes seriously the thought that a pause in the nuclear development might be a very good idea for North Korea. I think that there are going to have to be some changes, in other words, on the ground, in terms of the way the population of North Korea lives and how they look at the leadership. It's not that there's going to be a revolt necessarily, but the fact that they feel very uneasy about the whole business, and as a matter of fact, in due course, do begin to have problems of food insecurity, as well as various other forms of insecurity, are likely to influence the leadership. At that point, I believe that we will have some success in diplomacy. I would leave it to other experts to try to formulate who goes where and to whom, and maybe in what sequence. But I would suggest that this is a good time to be thinking about that before there does come a time of a test that demonstrates an ICBM quality in the North Korean situation. That will be a very different chapter than the one we have now, in which there is the threat of it. The very fact that such a threat is being made is awesome. It is not in the best interests of North Korea to be formulating any such policy, and it's a good time for us to indicate that it's unacceptable, and we will not stand by, and we can work, I think, with others to formulate a situation to change, really, the interior situation of North Korea.
Thank you. For you, Dr. Perry, the same question, but what in terms of a diplomatic process should be started? Is a bilateral option the case? Six-party talks? How do we, if we do the diplomatic process, what should the process look like to get people going and encouraged on that? A special envoy?
I think it might be desirable to have the President appoint a special envoy to meet with North Korea, as we did several times in the past. But the key here is putting together a diplomatic package which will be persuasive to North Korea, which will have strong incentives and strong disincentives which bring them to the table. I don't believe we can put that package together without having, as a minimum, China South Korea, and the United States working basically as a partnership to put the proposal together. The proposal will also involve Japan and Russia in some ways, but the ones with the three greatest contributors to that project will be South Korea, China, and Japan. So the big challenge, I suppose, is the challenge of getting these three disparate countries with totally different views about what they're trying to accomplish, getting those three countries to come together and agree on a common negotiating strategy. You need them because you need what they can contribute to it. South Korea, of course, is the country most intimately involved by this. They have to be a fundamental part of any process. And they also can contribute to the package of incentives through continuation of programs like they now have in Kaesong and replication of those programs in other locations. China can provide a very strong disincentives in terms of the threat to cut off the fuel supply, for example, today, so vital to North Korea today. And the United States also has very important incentives, particularly the security assurances they can give and the agreement to end the Korean War on an official basis. So it's easy to imagine the elements of a package which would be very persuasive to North Korea. What's hard to imagine is how you get the political smarts to put that package together, get those countries together, which involve fundamentally China, the U.S., and South Korea working as partners, and Russia and Japan involved as well. So it's a challenge. It's a huge diplomatic challenge. I don't think it's a challenge beyond our ability to tackle.
That's a good point, and Dr. Osland, I would like to get your feedback on that. Numerous people say that China is omnipotent in this particular case, and they could fix this the North Korea problem, the crisis, if they had the will and desire to do so. Others have questioned what their capabilities are to actually make a true impact here. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think part of it is we'll never know until they try, and they haven't really tried. I think there's also questions about the coal shipments. You know, first we have to wait and see what happens next year. There were some reports, in fact, that what they did was try to maintain the shipments, front load all the purchases for the year, and then say, well, now we're not buying anymore. But essentially, it was all done. So there's, you know, we have to, I think, be a little bit more sophisticated how we look at this as well. I think the days of China having a magic key, if it ever did, are probably over. They were probably overstated in the first place. Doesn't mean it can't have significant influence if it wanted to. But we also have to make sure we don't get confused, I think, by, you know, the idea that when we say, as we regularly do, China's really upset this time with North Korea. Now it's different. You know, now their patience is at an end. What that really means. First of all, I think, you know, everyone is a little bit more comfortable, I think, recognizing now that at this particular moment, what Xi Jinping does not like, the person he does not like is Kim Jong-un. That does not mean he doesn't like North Korea, and having North Korea there as a buffer state, something that causes us to do things like this and pour enormous amounts of time and material into it. The idea that that our goal and China's goals are probably ultimately they're very different. Can they be brought together on the specific nuclear issue? Potentially. But we often then start going off into the next phase, which is, okay, how do we solve this problem long term? I mean, really what we need are multiple strategies, right? And we can't just have a strategy for North Korea. We need a strategy for China in terms of North Korea. And I'm not sure we think about it in that sense. I think Secretary Perry was sort of getting there when he said, this is going to be a very difficult diplomatic problem. But we really need a China strategy for North Korea. Having just come back from Beijing, I'm fairly confident saying that China looks at this very differently from what we do, having had, you know, some pretty high-level conversations and I think almost, if I can put it this way, a certain level of confidence right now on the part of the Chinese that things are going their way, whether they interpret it as, you know, an administration that's going to give them a lot of leeway or an administration that's actually going to allow them to lock in the gains they felt they made under the last administration. There was a lot of confidence. And I think we should recognize that China will ask for things, and if to try to get them on board with this. They're not just going to come along, obviously. But some of those might be prices that are a little too high for us. They're going to go right at the alliance relationships and try to figure out how do you potentially decouple the United States from its allies if we really want to solve North Korea. That's one thing that we should be, I think, pretty aware of. So we need strategies for dealing with China. We also have to recognize that Japan and South Korea are not the Japan and South Korea of 1998 or 2006 or whenever. They are states that have changed as well. Obviously, first of all, we have a brand new South Korean government. And as Ambassador Hubbard was pointing out earlier in some of our talks, we actually should not be too quick to judge the progressive government as being a government we can't do any business with, because under the last government we actually did quite a bit. The rhetoric was terrible. The sort of surface level relations were terrible, but there were quite a lot of things that were actually done under that government, and we should at least be exploring whether the current government has some of the same potential to work with. Japan, however, is in a very different place today than it was in 98 or 2005 or whenever. It also has different capabilities, and those have to be factored into the equation. It's not just a matter of what the United States wants to do or can do. You have a Japan that is developing strike capabilities, that has better ballistic missile defense, that thinks about this in a different way potentially than we do. I think everyone wants to see a non-nuclear North Korea. So the question of what we accept and how we accept it and the signals we send, if it's a high-level delegation, does that in essence send the signal we're accepting this government in North Korea and what it's done? Has to factor in what our partners and allies will do, and has to factor in what other nations whom we may want to work with will do as well. I would say that the effort's very important, and I certainly think that Secretary Perry's experience in this is the guiding path, I think, for anyone who wants to undertake it, and we should. But I think we have to enter it with quite a degree of skepticism, to be quite honest, because of the road that we've traveled down to that makes this a much more intractable problem today than it was back a decade or so ago.
Yeah, I fully agree with Michael on that point.
I want to follow up with that because you did mention the decoupling issue here. How do we decouple issues with China? How does the U.S. decouple issues with China, such as the South China Sea, so that it's not put into one grand strategy or some type of grand bargain in order for China to aggressively deal with North Korea? We have to have other economic incentives or strategic and military incentives on the line.
Well, certainly setting the strategic playing field beforehand is very important. First of all, what is your strategy? What do we want out of this? We do have to decide, do we want to denuclearize North Korea? If that's what you want, fine, try to get it. I don't think it's going to be possible, but if that's what you want, that's what it is. Is it a freeze only? Is it to undermine the regime? First of all, what do we want? Second is to recognize that going in, the early demands may shape the negotiating environment going forward. China's going to ask a lot of things right up front, and we have to make sure, as will North Korea, and we have to make sure that we don't preemptively concess anything. You know, we give concessions just because we want to get to the table. We saw how that's worked in the past. It does not work, and we can't do it again. That doesn't mean we're not there to engage and to talk in an honest and forthright manner about what we want to try to do with both Beijing and Pyongyang, but I think preemptive concessions are a bad way to go. China is going to push that actually quite hard. It's going to push on the allies. It's going to push on other issues related to what we're going to give up. I mean, the first thing, which we all know, it's going to be a mirror freeze, right? It's the North Korean freeze for an American freeze on military cooperation, not cooperation, but activities with our allies, be it exercises or the like, and that's something we simply can't agree to. We have to make sure that we don't go in having given up any negotiating leverage to begin with, but that's going to actually be the first step. And I would say, again, coming from Beijing, they're signaling, it's not just to me and the group that I was with, I think they're signaling to all of us that they will expect U.S. concessions to get to the table, and we can't let that happen. Now, that may wind up short-circuiting your first attempt. Are you willing to do that? How desperate are you to get to the table? And that's going to send signals to the other side what they can press you on.
And the question, too, I think that we're grappling with is, do the North Koreans even want to negotiate with us? And that seems to be unclear. And I have this question that seems a bit cheeky, but I actually think, you know, it sounds like a joke, but it's not. But Dennis Rodman is currently in North Korea, and while this sounds ridiculous to Americans, to the DPRK, they're rolling the red carpet out for him. And further, while the State Department says he's not there on any official U.S. capacity, he apparently knows Trump. Is this the new version of ping pong diplomacy?
Well, let me just comment that for a long time I've hoped that something like the Voice of America might appear in North Korea. The North Koreans have been fairly successful in keeping news about the rest of the world away from most of their citizens. It seems to me that one of our major missions should be to reverse that, to help North Koreans become better informed. As we've become more sophisticated in terms of electronic means and communication throughout the world, this seems to me to be a very, very good platform, not as a target of propaganda, but just simply to indicate where Dennis Rodman comes from, what basketball is all about, what is going on, at least, so that there is much more of an affinity with North Korean population with American customs and the things that we are doing. A very different kind of point, seems to me, we ought to be thinking through, and this maybe some have who are very gifted in this field, but the North Koreans have demonstrated that they have a feel for cybersecurity, or the other way, cyber attack. This is an area which is sort of on the horizon. It's not a substitute for conventional warfare, but it is a way in which, obviously, those of you who have studied this much more than I have, various countries are thinking about how could you simply terminate the banking system of a country, or the health system of a country, or, in other words, create really casualties that go well beyond what would happen in the more conventional attacks, perhaps, of the past. It appears to me that we have opportunities in terms of working with North Korea and its citizenry in different ways other than maybe formal diplomacy for a while, to change the situation, to get the ground floor a little bit differently. That could also be the case, for that matter, with China and Japan and so forth, although there is more openness there, as the case may be. But I think that in following up my first points about the softening of the Korea economy and the change there, we really make a different playing field for diplomacy, as the population itself is sensed by the young leader to be something he's going to have to work with in a different kind of way. At the end of the day, we might point out that we anticipate that he will stop his nuclear tests, and for that matter, we would be working with him as we did with the former Soviet Union, somebody to reduce the number of weapons altogether and be helpful in that respect. But these are at least some ideas that come to my mind as we have this discussion.
So Senator Lugar brought up the issue of cyber, and I want to roll that in specifically because of North Korea. And roll off diplomacy just for a quick second. It's being reported in the New York Times, and I've asked you this question before, but a little more feedback on it would be really helpful, that we are potentially using left-of-launch means to retard the missile program within North Korea. What are your concerns about strategic stability with that? And is the value of slowing down North Korea's missile program worth it if it does change the dynamics of strategic stability by removing the command and control and communications of an adversary's nuclear program? Does that open up Pandora's box with other adversaries that might be dangerous?
Well, any time we undertake an attack against another country, a preemptive attack, you might say, we have to evaluate, on the one hand, what values we get from it and what costs are likely to accrue from it. We have in the United States, I firmly believe, the most capable cyber offensive and defensive capability of any country in the world. So on that basis, you might think, why don't we go cyber? Why don't we use that as a means of attacking them? And we could do a fair amount of damage to North Korea, including to their weapons programs, by doing that. But you have to ask the question, what's the cost of doing it? Well, we have a much greater cyber capability than they have. We also are much more dependent on computers and communications than they are. So we're highly vulnerable to cyber attacks, even attacks not as sophisticated as the one that we can mount. So anytime we start playing that game, which is challenging another country with our cyber attacks on them, we have to be prepared for cyber responses, and we're getting them. North Korean cyber capability, while not nearly as sophisticated as ours, is sophisticated enough to cause us a lot of problems, and has already caused us a lot of problems. So I am very leery about engaging in a tit-for-tat in cyber attacks between ourselves and North Korea. And I think that's what we seem to be on the verge of doing right now. And I would, if I were in a position of decision-making right now, I would think very carefully and very hard about engaging that kind of a battle.
Could I jump in on that for a second? I think it is an interesting question because there's a major risk, as Secretary Perry pointed out. Part of it, though, goes to the assessment that we would be making about the regime's assessment of its own strength and stability, right? So how do we think they think about their own strength and stability? Meaning, if you want to privilege strategic stability as your highest goal, i.e., we don't want a war, and and we're not going to preemptively attack. We're not going to go in and make regime change happen. So you're basically you are stuck with some type of North Korea for the foreseeable future, nuclear or otherwise. So take that as your starting point. Can you maintain strategic stability and yet be tactically disruptive? So if we are at one level trying to do things that in 1994 were the only way we could interfere with the nuclear program was to bomb it, basically, to pull in Israelis and the Iraqis from 1983. We didn't do that. We chose not to do that. Today you have other means. Some of those might be cyber. I'd be more comfortable if we just didn't talk about it at all and let the experts do what they're going to do. But if we are talking about it, we don't know what the North Korean assessment of that is. I mean, there are still people who believe that North Koreans didn't launch the cyber attack against Sony a few years ago. So we don't know what the North Koreans think, and we don't know what the truth. Sometimes that ambiguity is good. But can you use that tactical disruptiveness in order to maintain stability? One thing might be trying to frustrate the program, the ICBM program going forward. It's probably going to buy you a little bit of time, not a lot, though I don't know if any of us are really experts on how much time you can buy with that. But is it more useful, potentially, and here's the risk and where it would be different from what Secretary Perry said, by throwing these types of elbows occasionally, a cyber elbow, that you're sending a message to the regime that you are upping the ante and the risks. That's why I started off by saying, what is their own assessment of their stability? If we throw this cyber elbow here and there, and as Senator Lugar said, get them worried about the stability of the economy, which at base really is what has made this regime much more confident, not to mention given it the national power, the national wealth to actually pursue these programs. Where are they getting all this money from? Is that useful in maintaining this level of strategic stability? It seems to me it's a gamble. It might be one worth taking if, again, what you're looking at is not the immediate outcome of that action, but a second-order result, which is to maintain this larger, longer-term policy of containment and deterrence on North Korea. If you want to let natural forces work themselves out, and we're already in the second quarter century of trying to deal with this, so we've already shown patience. We might have to show a lot more patience. But if you want to let those natural forces work themselves out, do you achieve that more likely by letting it be known to the North Koreans that there are costs, they are raising the risk levels that they don't want to get into by certain levels of action? Again, it brings it away from the negotiating table. It puts you back in a sort of game of shadows type of environment. But if I were the North Koreans, I'd love to keep negotiating with the United States. I mean, why not? You know, it's gotten them to where they are today from their perspective. We should not be walking away from the table, but that doesn't mean we also should be hanging up our boxing gloves and other things that we can bring to the overall environment away from the table.
Let me go back to that 1994 decision. Yeah. Very instructive. I was Secretary of Defense at the time, so I'm intimately familiar with it. I had on my desk, in fact, a plan to attack and to destroy the nuclear facility Yongbyon. We did not reject that plan. We just put it second in line to a diplomatic option. We said, if we can succeed diplomatically, we won't do this. But if we could not succeed diplomatically, we were quite prepared to do that. As we looked at it at the time, again, it's a value and cost situation. The value then was we could have completely destroyed the North Korean nuclear program. It would take them probably 10 years to have recovered from that kind of an attack then. And the cost was that there would be undoubtedly military reprisals against South Korea. So that's what had to be weighed. It had to be weighed not only by us, but by the South Korean government. Today, if we look at the value and cost equation, first of all, we don't have the value. We cannot destroy the North Korean nuclear program. We have no idea where their 15 or 20 nuclear bombs are. We can take out their test sites, which would be a good thing to do, no doubt. We can take out their missile launch sites. We can do many things. We cannot destroy their missile program. We cannot destroy their nuclear program. So the value is not nearly as great. And the cost is much greater because the potential damage to South Korea now is perhaps an order of magnitude greater than it would have been then. So one can't be, at least if you're Secretary of Defense or the President, you can't be emotional about these problems. You have to look at them objectively from the value of cost. And back in 1994, the value of cost equation was pretty close. And if we had not succeeded in diplomacy, we might very well have decided to have done that.
With that, let's open up to some audience questions. If you just raise your hand, there's going to be roving mics. And just please make sure to speak clearly and loudly so everyone can hear you. Right there, Tim.
Thank you for an excellent program. Joe Bosco, formerly with the Defense Department. It seems to be a given that China is the key to the North Korean program. And yet we keep hearing that China is reluctant to take decisive action because it would lose its buffer state. And Mr. Osland points out that we should not make preemptive concessions in order to get China to do things with us against North Korea. But what if the Trump administration had a strategy of disincentives to China? That is, if you don't help us with North Korea, we won't help you with Taiwan or some other issue that China cares about. What if we reverse the dynamic of the incentives and disincentives to get China to cooperate?
Well, specifically, the concept, in general, I'm not disputing. The specifics of coupling this with Taiwan, I would be completely opposed to. It's a separate issue altogether. It has separate dynamics to it, and I would try to keep it completely separate from that. And if the Chinese were not willing to discuss these as separate issues, then I wouldn't want to play that game. I don't know. What do you think? But Michael, you're closer to this broader problem than I am.
Well, I agree with Secretary Perry and Joe. I get the logic behind it. I think what worries me is that approach. I think you would, first of all, I think we would probably we would probably be more likely to undertake it if we had already decided what we want to do is challenge China on a number of different issues, or implicitly challenge them by not working with them on a number of different issues. So if we already made that calculus, you know, things are not going our way, and so what we actually need to do is shake up the dynamic. And by the way, we're not going to link it to something that's even a bigger issue. It means you've already said, I'm willing to take the risk of, you know, be it Taiwan, and I definitely wouldn't link it to Taiwan, but, you know, be it Taiwan, South China Sea, whatever, trade issues, whatever it is, you've already made the first determination that you want to change where the Sino-U.S. relationship is today. That'd be number one. Number two is that, you know, again, trying to think of it from the Beijing perspective, which is admittedly, you know, a thought experiment and dangerous, but from the Beijing perspective, it's tempting, I think, on their part, to try to wrap us up into one of these sort of grand bargain type deals. And you start hearing that floated around lately, as in what we need is a grand bargain with China. Because I think China is probably willing to accept higher short-term losses in that grand bargain for long-term gains. Meaning we might think, oh, you know, we sort of got them where we want them on a South China Sea issue, but there's, you know, they're coming at it orthogonally from a bunch of different angles that we're not thinking about, and at some level it's a bandwidth problem. I think it's, you know, it's our ability, because we're actually trying to deal with North Korea. Now we've opened up an entirely different set of both strategic calculations on our part and actual negotiating with them, and I don't know if we actually have all of that bandwidth to do it. Whereas what it seems to be is that it would get you to that position that you want to be earlier. I'd actually be very worried that what are the 6 different things I haven't thought about, you know, that are actually going to be feeding into this 2 moves down the line, which is why I started off, you know, with that saying, at least if I were, you know, trying to think about how to do it, it's to hold that line in the beginning. We know what we want to get, or hopefully we'll decide what we want to get with North Korea. Don't pre-negotiate yourself into something to get to the point where you start negotiating that. And that is, to me, the difficulty of bringing China in. And again, having had these discussions recently, they're very aware of it, and I think they've already formulated the approach that they would like to take, where they'd like to get us into agreeing to certain things, just so we wind up sitting around that table. And that's where we would think the work has begun. But from their perspective, they've already gained 3 or 4 things that they'd like to ultimately see. So I definitely get the logic of it. I'm a little bit more leery of how it would play out in reality.
Just picking up for a moment,
Yep.
The China question, I think it's been very disappointing. The current administration has at least taken us out of the TransPacific Partnership Treaty. Here we had a situation in which the United States leadership with regard to the Pacific countries was really going to grow, a dynamic possibility, which must surely have good implications, and not specifically on what we're dealing with today on the ICBM in North Korea, but clearly with regard to who's who out there. Now, given our absence, China will have a much greater role, maybe a dominant role in the whole picture. And we're sort of out of the picture there, except for individual United States firms or various others that are dealing in business. I hope we can change that course of action at some point.
Stanley Roth, no affiliation. A question for Dr. Perry. In your opening remarks, you talked about North Korea's shrewd policies, a word I haven't heard applied before, but it makes sense. Yet they seem to be on the verge of a very unshrewd policy, which is not recognizing that they have, in effect, a nuclear deterrent now, and that they need instead to be able to threaten the continental U.S. with a combination of ICBMs, maybe hydrogen bombs, mobile systems, and the like. So the question, obviously your proposal, which I completely support, is to try to put them back on the shrewd path by coming up with incentives and disincentives, preferably in partnership with the countries you described. What if it doesn't work? The plan B, specifically, does that mean we need a massive defensive program? Does it mean we need to beef up counterproliferation? Should we even consider reintroducing tactical nuclear weapons into South Korea? Hopefully better ideas than any of the things I've just thrown out.
Yeah, we have to have a plan B, not only because it's a good general principle, but because in this case the probability of success of plan A is not really high. It's something I believe we should try, but I can't give you high confidence it's going to succeed because of the various complications of putting all this together. So we need to have a plan B. or even a plan B, C, and D. But one of those plans, at least, will have to be a military plan. We have to be prepared to take military action, and North Korea has to understand that we're prepared to take military action. I'm not recommending military action because the downsides of it are very, very great. It's not just that they can do now what they could do 10 or 15 years ago, which has caused considerable damage in South Korea with their conventional forces. But that action could escalate all too easily. South Korea isn't going to just sit there and take it while they're being attacked. They're going to respond. So you can see a military conflict underway in Korea, in a country that has about 30,000 American troops there. So we're going to get involved in it. So what we see is the possibility of this military action escalating into a full-scale conventional conflict. That conflict, I'm confident if it happens, would be lost by North Korea. The South Korean military forces, augmented by American naval and air power, would surely defeat the North Koreans in time. When that happens, the thing that the North Korean regime most values, which is its hold on the leadership, is going to be very much endangered. And so at that stage, we might see some sort of a Hail Mary pass, a use of nuclear weapons as a last-ditch effort to try to save the country. So I think the nuclear weapons are dangerous, not because I think they're going to use them in a preemptive attack, but because I can all too easily envision a military conflict which escalates, which they lose, and which they then use their nuclear weapons to try to last desperate attempt to save the regime. This is not a fantastic scenario. I mean, it's not a fantasy to spill out the scenario. It could happen. So I think, yes, we have to have Plan B and C. Plan B is certainly a military option. But we have to understand the great risks involved in taking that, which is why I think we should put an all-out effort to try to make the diplomatic effort succeed. By the way, I think it's useful for North Korea to understand we have a Plan B also. In 1994, when we negotiated with them, they knew very well we had a Plan B, and they believed we were prepared to use it. So that helps somewhat in the negotiation process. It helps the coercive element of the negotiation.
I'd just like to say, though, I think Stan's question is really fundamental, which is what has been the thinking of the current regime? Why do you want ICBMs? The easy answer is, well, why not? You know, is it technological determinism? Once you get your short range and your medium range, you're going to move up the ladder. Maybe that's part of the answer. But as you said, they already had a deterrent. I mean, Japan and South Korea already face a potentially existential threat, which honestly we're way far away from, even if they can reach the west coast of the United States. We don't face an existential threat. But Seoul, Busan, Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, I mean, they already face an existential threat. So what is the thinking for the ICBM? Is it that the sense that our deterrence could only be really challenged if we were under threat, which, as you said, is not a shrewd move, that we would not be deterred from acting against North Korea if our two allies were under threat, which is obviously what they want. They want the United States to be breaking those assurances. But I at least haven't heard as much discussion as I thought there might be. There's discussions about what does it mean to us at the end of the day when they have an ICBM that can hit the West Coast or farther. But Stan, your question about why get to this point, I think is really a more fundamental one about the thinking inside of the regime that I haven't seen a lot of good work, at least on the outside, being done. And I think we should be thinking about it because it may give insights into these other questions about what you might get in terms of that larger level of strategic stability, because this, from our perspective, is strategically destabilizing. Perhaps from them it is the ultimate strategic stabilizer, in which case the odds of getting to that level of agreement seem to me to be rapidly diminishing.
This question is in regards to the North Korean missile program. Recently, we've been hearing a lot about the many tests that they've been conducting. A lot of the missiles that they've been testing have been landing really close to to our allies in Japan and South Korea. I'm personally really curious about what their true motives for these tests are. Whether you think that they're more geared towards asserting their dominance and displaying their prowess on an international stage, or whether they're actually trying to test out their nuclear power or their missile powers.
I think specifically the 4 missiles fired off the coast of Japan were shot across the bow. They wanted to demonstrate to Japan how vulnerable they were to an attack from North Korea. I think the experimental testing goals were quite secondary to the political goals of those tests. That's my view. Michael, what do you think?
No, I would certainly agree. I mean, it was a sophisticated test. It was multiple launches simultaneously hitting the same area. And they followed it up with the rhetoric, here's how we're targeting your bases, but, the rhetoric had some backing to it. And again, the folks, certainly inside the military and the operations planners and the like are increasingly aware of this. I think on the outside, we still sort of think of it in some ways as a pretty static threat. We can't take out the entire nuclear program. We could take out certain things. But we could look for major nodes that we would hit and the like. But this is a regime that is rapidly multiplying the ways in which it can strike its neighbors and potentially us. I mean, one of the biggest advances has been the road mobile TELs, the mobile launched missiles, which are much more difficult to track, to find, to kill. That is something they've poured an enormous amount of energy into, and it's very different. This is not we see it stand up because it's in a fixed and emplaced area, and we can have sort of constant warning on that. That's not how it is today. The other thing, and I actually don't know, Secretary, I'd be very interested in your take on this, or Senator, the submarine program, which sort of the last thing. I mean, the complexity, at least of our style of SSBN. It's the most complex weapons system ever created. The idea that North Korea is going to have a really effective SSBN, big or small, I would have just discarded it up until, well, when they started firing missiles from it, which is just very recently. So how credible is it? What are our really, no kidding, assessments about where they're going with this and what it might mean? Because once you get those, then I think you introduce a different dynamic, certainly from the perspective of a country like Japan. And South Korea, that starts them thinking about what do we need to do for ultimate deterrence ourselves. Once you get these proven platforms at sea, and Secretary, I don't know if you've thought about where they're actually going with this, but that is something I would have thought 25 years down the road. Now it may be here.
I don't think they're very far along on this, but I think your comment of how serious it could be and how much it complicates our defense is exactly right. The various defenses we have in place on there are sort of posited on ground-based missiles. Right? You have sea-based missiles coming to Japan from the east instead of the west, for example. It's a wholly different, and from shorter ranges, so it's a wholly different situation. I think they've got a long way to go to have a credible submarine threat, but we have to take it seriously in the meantime.
Hi, Joe DiTrone. Thank you for the panel, just outstanding. Let me just posit a comment and a question. China. I mean, given the developments in the Korean Peninsula, one would think it would be in China's interest to indeed be not only proactive, but even that much more proactive, and not to be incentivized to be more proactive, because the likelihood of us being the corporate us, successful in negotiations means that we will do more on missile defense. We'll be doing more with the trilateral with South Korea, Japan, and the United States. We'll be doing more on joint military exercises. And certainly Japan and South Korea will be looking at possibly even maybe looking at their own missile and indeed the nuclear capabilities. So the region becomes that much more unstable. And for China, that can't be a good scenario. So isn't that by definition a requirement on the part of China to indeed, not to be incentivized to do it, but on their own, because it's in their interest, to be doing more? And thus I ask this question: are they really doing as much as they should be doing, or they could be doing, while they indeed want to keep stability in the region? They don't want refugees flowing over the border. They don't want loose nukes and so forth. So what is the calculus for saying how much can China do while maintaining stability in the Korean Peninsula?
We've talked already about how a diplomatic approach, however desirable, might be very difficult to execute. I think primarily because of the difficulty of working out the partnership with China. The only reason I have some hope that that could be done is for the very reasons that you described. This problem is the worst problem for China that it is for the United States right now. All of the bad things that could happen here would very adversely affect China. So they ought to be very interested in finding a way to curtailing the potential damage from a North Korean nuclear program. If we offered them an opportunity to be a partner in doing this, they ought to seriously consider that offer and take it. Having said that, and I still say that I don't have a high probability we could pull it off, but the objective arguments from China's point of view should be in our favor for all the reasons you described, Joe.
Joe, it's a great question. I mean, I think we should be asking it a lot more. I think from one perspective, we should, give due deference to China's strategic thinking and the flexibility that they show in responding to changing environments. So on the one hand, if I'm sitting in Beijing now, so you're coming off of essentially 8 years of strategic patience. So you've seen a very United States reticent, to get involved. So you've had a breathing space where you haven't had to face potentially some of these pressures. So now you're trying to adjust to a new administration. And you know as well as anybody about the administration's staffing issues, about the strategies you're waiting to see that they're going to proclaim. They did a review. So at one level, it might be a waiting moment for Beijing to say, okay, what are these guys going to actually wind up doing? And then, whether we've anticipated it and laid out our 4 responses or we're just going to make it up on the fly once we see it, that may be an issue. You then, I think, have to factor in South Korea. Just like us, they're going to be waiting to see how much can we work with this new administration, a progressive administration. They probably feel they can work with it more than they could the last couple of administrations in South Korea. So that, again, the idea, back to your original point, that, well, if I'm sitting in China's shoes, this doesn't look good for me because we're going to have tighter cooperation between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. They may be calculating, no, you might not get that tighter coordination. First of all, the Tokyo-Seoul angle, we know how bad that is. So already you've got friction in how far the trilateral cooperation is going to go, so you know it's not going to be seamless. So let's wait it out and see what happens. Number 2, Xi Jinping has been fairly sophisticated in finding areas of historical, rhetorical cooperation with South Korea vis-a-vis Japan. I'm thinking about, for example, the museum shrine, really, up in Harbin to the South Korean young student who assassinated Japan's premier back in 1909, which has become a pilgrimage site for South Koreans in China. So you've sort of shown that you've got this similar sense of solidarity in the face of Japan's historical intransigence. So, how far can you press that? And maybe you can do more of it with that progressive government. Secondly, can you peel the Trump administration away from its allies more generally, simply by intimating that the risks are just too high in an administration that at least came into office intending to ramp down the level of engagement that it had around the world. So you sort of divorce it even from the particularities of Seoul and Tokyo today and just simply say, here's an administration that maybe we can push those tender points where it wanted to change business, the way that Washington did business. All of that being said, then, I think Beijing is just as equally able to pivot and come up with that type of response when it considers that its interests are being harmed. So it gets back to your point. If we had a firm approach going forward, if we were actually getting some concrete traction on the trilateral end, then maybe Beijing says, okay, I got to get involved now in a way that's more cooperative, where things that I thought were going in my direction are actually not going to go in my direction. But I don't think they're there yet. The sense I was getting is that they'd like to see how this plays out for a little bit. And then one last thing that we haven't mentioned that I would like to throw in on the table, I think it actually was slightly mentioned, would be a North Korean provocation of the kind that we started thinking about with Kim Jong-il, whether it was Yongpyong-do or Cheonan or whatever it was. We haven't really seen anything like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. We had Sony. But this has been a regime that's taking care of business at home, right? Kim Jong-nam at home, meaning, what matters at home. So doing it in Malaysia because it matters in Pyongyang. It's really been you know, the House of Cards type of stuff at home to solidify Kim Jong-un's rule. So from one perspective, you see that level of stability. They have not thrown in one of those wrenches that could backfire, that could make Seoul or Washington say, we've got to do something. And of course, somewhere in their heads is Syria, somewhere. Very different, obviously, to launch a one-off strike against a Syrian airfield against North Korea, but it's got to be in their heads somewhere. You know, and just the capability. You know, the U.S. was able to put 50 of these missiles where they wanted. So, you know, you're thinking about it. But where would the provocation be? What might it be? And what might it look like under Kim Jong-un, if I'm right, that we really haven't seen something like that yet? I could be wrong, and, you know, correct me. But what might he be doing that's, again, going to be different? It's almost as if, you know, if you talk about 90s and you talk about the 2000s, it's almost that we're moving away from that brute force world where you've got to break things and blow things up. You can do it in much more shadowy, sophisticated, difficult ways now, and you really press your counterpart, your target, to respond, because there has to be attribution for it, and you have to figure out what's a proportionate response, actually, as Secretary Perry was just saying. So how is Kim Jong-un thinking about this? What does he have that might knock all of these discussions off base? I don't know.
Thank you so much for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. My name is Harry Kim from the Wilson Center. The question that I have is about the THAAD. It seems that the THAAD has been the thorniest topic in East Asia for the past few months or not years.
Can you speak a little bit more to the microphone for them?
Sure. So the THAAD, the question is about THAAD. So THAAD has been the thorniest topic for East Asia. And I know that there is going to be a bilateral summit between President Moon and President Trump in the end of June. So the question is, what should be the President Trump's way to persuade President Moon to accept that from going forward in the future?
I know you have a lot to say about that, so why don't...
I didn't quite get the question.
What should be President Trump's goal to encourage the South Koreans to accept the THAAD system or keep the THAAD system?
I think that's primarily a political question instead of a question of how South Koreans defend themselves. I think that has very little capability to defend against a determined North Korean attack. One with multiple missiles and one with decoys and countermeasures involved. So if I were asked the question by the South Korean Minister of Defense, how is this going to defend our country, I wouldn't have anything positive to say. On the other hand, it gives them a good feeling to have a defensive system there. And so for that reason alone, they might want to have it there. And they have to balance that against the political problem it creates with China, which is very considerable. China's already implemented reprisals against South Korea for accepting that system. It's going to be a very, very dicey political question for the new president to accept. On the one hand, is he going to continue to accept this bad news, this bad reactions from China by leaving it there, or is he going to pull it out and accept bad vibrations from the United States, his erstwhile ally? I don't know how he's going to resolve that issue, but I think it's a very difficult issue. But I think it's my point is a political, domestic political and a geopolitical issue, and has to be considered as such. I don't think there's any reason to believe that the system is now deployed there is going to defend Seoul against a reasonably determined attack with the multiple missiles that North Korea already has, in particular if those missiles have decoys attached to them. It can swamp the system all too easily. And that's fundamental to a defense system. If you can swamp it, you can beat it. Mm-hmm. It has nothing to do with the testing program. Even if the THAAD had tested 100% on its test, this problem is fundamental.
Does anybody have any other thoughts on that?
I agree with Bill.
Okay, well, with that, before we wrap up, I just want to again thank SAIS and the U.S. Korea Institute for their help and partnership in this. And again, I want to encourage people to go to the wjperryproject.org, where you can learn more about subjects related to nuclear dangers, as well as take free online courses. And with that, please help me thank Senator Lugar, Dr. Oslin, and Secretary Perry.